Hello, everyone. I would like to welcome you all to this webinar, which will present my doctoral research conducted in the School of Business of the University of Nicosia under the supervision of Professor Kokinagi, who we'll have the pleasure to have with us.
Hello, the pleasure is all mine.
So to begin with the presentation and make some introductory notes, my research examined collective intelligence as a systemic dimension that can provide guidance about the formation of teams facing a crisis and an assessment of their maturity levels, and has eventually arrived to the development of the collective intelligence maturity assessment model, which will be referred to in this webinar as the CIMA model. Over the next few slides, we will examine the problem statement and arrive to the research gap. Low probability, high impact events is the domain in which the gap in theory has been identified. Low probability, high impact events may include crises, disasters, and emergencies. So, Professor Kokinagi, before we proceed to the conceptual definition of low probability, high impact events, can we think of any examples of such events?
Well, looking back at the time that you submitted your proposal to the School of Business, I remember that it was very recent, the incident at Marie. And this is an exemplification of a low probability, high impact event. And as by coincidence, when you submitted your final proposal, we were experiencing the aftermaths of the tsunami in the Indian Ocean. And later on, a little bit later, we were discussing about the Fukushima incident. And the defense of the thesis, the actual defense of the thesis, took place during the COVID pandemic. So one way or another, the critical points in the development of this doctoral thesis coincided with low probability, high impact events.
That's exactly the case. The examples that you mentioned exhibit some characteristics that basically form the conceptual definition of this kind of events. The first dimension is threat. The second dimension is decision making, and the third dimension is awareness, the surprise effect. Low probability, high impact events appear as an unexpected surprise situation of serious threat to the decision maker, allowing only a short time for decision before the situation significantly escalates. The management process of such events consists of three main phases. The pre-event phase, in which prevention and preparation activities take place, the actual event that necessitates immediate response, and the post-event phase, in which recovery and review take place. So within the domain of low probability, high impact events, the research gap identified is concerned with decision-making difficulties. Decision-making is a very important element for the management of LOFIs. Uncertainty levels when faced with an adverse event, such as a crisis, escalate, and this in turn reduces rationality. The literature points to cognitive limitations in decision-making processes. Existing approaches and methods used for the anticipation and management of such events have fundamental limitations. Judgment or decision-making biases is the most common identified the most common identified limitation with a considerable impact on the quantification of probability, uncertainty, and risk. So far, we have examined the key attributes of LOFIS, which is the domain in which the gapping theory exists, and we have examined also decision-making, which is actually the gapping theory identified. So let us examine now collective intelligence and see whether the concept can be applied as the solution to the problem. The effect of judgment or decision-making biases can be lessened or eliminated through the use of collective intelligence. A collective intelligence emerges from the collaboration of many individual entities and predicts how well a group will perform on a wide range of different tasks. The use of collective intelligence provides a diversity of viewpoints and input that can deter pattern obsession, self-serving bias, belief prevention, and negative framing effects. Therefore, collective intelligence results to a diversity of assumptions, solutions, and beliefs that collectively are found to mitigate human biases and lead to more objective decision outcomes. So let us examine now the factors that are significantly correlated with collective intelligence. The first factor is the average social sensitivity of team members. So this would be the RME level of the team. And we will see later on in this webinar how the RME level can be calculated for individuals, but also for teams. The second factor significantly correlated with collective intelligence is the proportion of the female participants in the team. And finally, the third factor, which is significantly correlated with collective intelligence, is the equal distribution of conversational turn-taking and participation in discussion. So this would be the team interaction level. The main research question that my research set out to answer is what are the significant factors that need to be included in a CI maturity assessment model examining the preparedness of organizations for managing LOFIS. Building on the theoretical foundations of maturity assessment models, the aim of my research has been to design and develop a CI maturity model for the assessment of organizations' preparedness and resilience towards LOFIS. Based on the main research question, I formulated 4 research objectives. This table here aligns the research objectives with the research strategies and techniques employed for data collection. The first research objective, which has been to identify indicators related to the management of LOFIS, has been met with secondary data collection. The second research objective, which has been to explore indicators related to the management of LOFIS in the presence of CI-supported decision-making, has been met with the collection of secondary data and the conduction of multiple experiments. The third research objective, which was to design and develop a CI maturity assessment model, has been met with the collection of secondary data, the contribution of expert opinion, and the conduction of the multiple experiments. And finally, the last research objective, which has been to validate how the proposed CI maturity assessment model can be applied to assess teams' maturity levels in dealing with LOFIS, has been met solely with the conduction of the multiple experiments. As I mentioned earlier, the aim of my research was to materialize a CI maturity model for the assessment of teams' preparedness and resilience towards LOFIS. The whole process followed to arrive to this maturity model can be summarized in 3 main stages that form the research outline. During the first stage, indicators and factors which are of critical importance for the evolution and maturation of collective intelligence in teams and collective performance in relation to the management of LOFIS have been investigated at a theoretical level. During the second stage, 3 interconnected experiments were conducted and primary data were collected. So at this stage, indicators and factors important for the evolution and maturation of collective intelligence and collective performance have been investigated at an empirical level. At the third stage, an analysis of the primary data has been conducted and led to a new model for maturity assessment. Now, this model has resulted following a decision science research methodology with 2 iterations of the development cycle. During the first development cycle, an initial design of the CIMA model has been proposed. In addition, an initial analysis of the primary data collected was performed and resulted into the identification of additional factors, which in turn advised the second iteration of the development cycle. And during the second development cycle, an improved decision of the CIMA model has been proposed, and a complete analysis of the primary data has been conducted. In the last phase of the second development cycle, the results of the data analysis were taken into consideration, and a final design of the CIMA model has been proposed. The figure here presents the maturity model development cycle followed to arrive to the design of the CIMA model. The complete development cycle, as shown here, consists of 4 phases: define scope, design model, evaluate design, and reflect evolution. Due to time constraints, we will not examine each phase separately, but we will focus more on the experiments conducted in the evaluate design phase of the first iteration of the cycle. As previously mentioned, for the development of the CIMA model, a design science research methodology has been followed. Design science is a problem-oriented approach, and therefore the development cycle is initiated by a need and require intention. As far as I know, my research is the first to examine jointly decision-making, collective intelligence, and maturity assessment models. The need for the development of the model has been investigated in detail through the examination of the topics in relation to decision-making, and the opportunity for the development of the CIMA model has been examined thoroughly through the study of the topics in relation to collective intelligence. So let us see at this point some information about the experiments conducted. In total, 3 interlinked experiments have been conducted, each with a different focus. The focus of the first experiment was to assess the individual intelligence of the participants and included 3 psychometric tests, which all participants were required to complete individually. Following the completion of the first experiment, the sample was split in half. 50% of the participants were, based on convenience, selected to proceed to the second experiment, continuing to work individually, and these participants formed the control group. The other 50% of the participants formed the experimental group and proceeded to the second experiment working in teams. The allocation and the formation of the teams within the experimental group was formed and performed randomly. So in the control group, we had no collective intelligence, and in the experimental group, we had the emergence of collective intelligence. So the second experiment aimed to assess collective intelligence in the context of LOFIS and included 3 tasks that participants were required to complete, either working individually, this is for the control group, or either working in teams, and this applies to the experimental group. After the completion of the second experiment, only those participants who were selected to work in teams during the second experiment have been asked to proceed to the third experiment. This was due to the fact the aim of the third experiment was to assess the transactive memory systems that emerged in teams during the conduction of experiment 2. Therefore, it is important to note here that transactive memory systems, just as collective intelligence, emerge only in teams. I would also like to, yes?
Sorry for interrupting, but perhaps we can spend a moment or two and talk a bit about transactive memory systems. It's not something that is widely known.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, so transactive memory systems are mechanisms through which groups collectively encode, store, and retrieve knowledge. Such systems include memory stored in each individual within a team, the interactions between memory within the individuals, as well as the processes that updates the memories of the individuals. So I would like to mention here that to the best of my knowledge, my research is the first to examine transactive memory systems in relation to collective intelligence. And thank you very much for giving me the opportunity with your question to talk a little bit more about transactive memory systems. Okay, moving on, this slide presents information on the samples selected for the experiments. I had a total of 100 participants with varied risk management relevance. The Reading the Mind in the Eyes test, the folk physics test part 1, and the Big Five personality test were used to measure individual intelligence in experiment 1. The 3 tests are extensively validated. This is an example of the Reading the Mind in the Eyes test, or the RME test, which measures the level of emotional intelligence, and it is one of the factors proven to significantly correlated with collective intelligence. And for this reason, this specific test has been used in the experiment. This is an example of the folk physics test. This specific test was used in order to measure the participants' ability and level of spontaneously understanding the workings of the physical world. So therefore, the test measured fundamental skills needed for the successful management of LOFIS.
So in this particular, the previous one, in this particular example, what is the correct answer?
In this particular example, the correct answer is C. Therefore, when the 2 screws are turned the same amount as shown in this figure here, the ball will move towards point H.
And this is an example of applying fundamental knowledge from high school to solve everyday problems that may appear.
Exactly. So moving on now to the last test that was used in the second experiment. We have here an example of the Big Five personality test. Individual personality traits were used and were measured in the experiment in order to determine whether personality traits are positively correlated with humans' ability to make inferences about notions of the physical world, as well as their capacity to explain and predict the mental state of other people. And in addition, we measured personality traits in experiment 2 in order to explore the relationship between personality traits and collective intelligence in the context of low probability, high impact events.
Can we give perhaps an example of two about personality traits?
Yes, of course, we can.
It is there, but I doubt it is easily identifiable.
Okay, so I can mention a few characteristics of each of each personality trait. In regards to extraversion, extraversion shows sociability and the tendency to seek stimulation in the company of others. High extraversion is often perceived as attention seeking. Agreeableness, on the other hand, is the tendency to be compassionate and cooperative rather than suspicious and antagonistic towards others. It is also a measure of one's trusting and helpful nature. In regards to conscientiousness, this personality trait shows tendency to be organized, show self-discipline, aim for achievement, and prefer planned rather than spontaneous behavior. Emotional stability, on the other hand, shows and demonstrates the tendency to be prone to psychological stress and refers to the degree of impulse control. And finally, intellect or imagination shows openness to adventure, unusual ideas, openness to curiosity, and variety of experiences. Okay, moving on now to the second experiment. The experiment involved the completion of 3 tasks. The first task was an emergency planning activity based on a case study. The second task was the folk physics test part 2. And the third task was tsunami disaster scenario. The set of the tasks used in the experiment was based on established taxonomies of team tasks and similar tasks used in prior studies in the field of collective intelligence. More specifically, the McGrath task circumplex was used in order to develop the set of the tasks. The McGrath task circumplex is an established and validated taxonomy characterizing tasks according to the dominant coordination process required for its accomplishment by a team. So the first task, the emergency planning activity based on a case study, was designed on material obtained from a course offered by the Federal Emergency Management Agency, which is a division of the United States Department of Homeland Security committed in helping people before, during, and after disasters. And moving on straight to the third task, because we about folk physics for the folk physics test in a previous slide. The third task of experiment 2 was a tsunami disaster scenario that was based on material adapted by Stop Disasters, which is a game that has been launched by the United Nations International Strategy for Disaster Reduction, and many organizations involved in emergency management and disaster risk reduction have participated in the development of its contents and the making of the game. For this specific task, participants were initially given 10 minutes to study a fast facts sheet provided in order to help them complete the task. They were asked to remember as much information as possible, as they were not allowed to take any notes on the information provided on tsunamis. So this, for team members, meant that they had to coordinate in such a way so that they can collectively remember as many information as they could. So it's very crucial to think of this task in relation to transactive memory systems and what we've talked in previous slides about TMS. These are the questions participants were asked to complete. And we arrive finally to the third experiment. Here, the dimensions of the transactive memory systems developed in the teams during the conduction of the second experiment were measured, with participants being asked to complete individually a TMS scale developed by Lewis. This is an example of the TMS measurement model that was used. This model measures the three components of TMS: specialization, credibility, and coordination. So the conduction of the three interconnected experiments that we examined in the previous slides enabled the collection of primary data. The initial analysis of these data was, as advised, the second iteration of the development cycle, which began by redesigning and improving basically the CIMA model. And we have here the evolution of the CIMA model after the completion of the first development cycle. So we have the initial design and the improved design. The final model is shown in this slide. The specific factors incorporated in the final CIMA model have either a direct positive impact on collective intelligence or on collective performance. More specifically, 11 factors are incorporated in the model, and these factors mature from an intuitive to an integrated level. The factors included in the final CIMA model have been placed in 4 categories: team composition, transactive memory systems, team interaction, and task classification. And based on these categories, the maturity levels have been developed. This is one of the main outputs of my research and can be used by practitioners in order to assess the maturity level of collective intelligence and collective performance of their teams within the context of managing logies. Here we have the definitions of the maturity levels developed for team composition and transactive memory system, and the definitions of the maturity levels developed for team interaction and task classification. The data collected through the conduction of the 3 interlinked experiments were analyzed using R. R is a programming language and software environment for statistical computing and graphical display available under an open source license. Over the following slides, we will examine a few of the main research findings of my research. One of the main findings of my research is that the ability of understanding social causality, as measured by the reading the mind in the eyes test, has low to zero correlations with the 5 primary dimensions of adult personality, as measured by the Big 5 personality test. I consider this finding to be very important because when I started formulating my specific research questions, I expected to find correlation between the ability of understanding social causality and the 5 primary dimensions of adult personality. Furthermore, an additional main finding is that a higher level of collective intelligence is associated with higher collective performance. And this finding relates to an additional finding worth mentioning, the fact that belonging in a team is associated with higher collective intelligence as compared to working individually. So the findings of my research support the findings of previous studies that show evidence that collective problem solving leads to enhanced performance and improved solutions that no individual can achieve alone. And in addition, the findings of my research suggest that collective intelligence predicts how well a team will perform on a wide range of different tasks. And we have here some figures showing the distribution of scores for the control group in comparison with the team's scores for task 1, task 2, and task 3. The empirical results of my research show that higher levels of emotional intelligence in the team are associated with a higher level of performance. More specifically, my research suggests that theory of mind, as measured by the reading the mind in the ICE test, and consequently emotional intelligence have a predictive power over the performance outcomes of teams.
Yes. Sorry to interrupt. Many people are using the term emotional intelligence, sometimes with reference to different contexts. Perhaps it is a good point here to present what emotional intelligence is within the framework of this research, how has been defined and how has been exploited.
Yes. So emotional intelligence is basically the capability of individuals to recognize their own emotions and those of others, and distinguish between different feelings, and use emotional information in order to guide thinking and behavior. So this is the definition that has been approached within the context of my research. In regards to the diversity in the teams, the results confirm the notion that teamwork output is the result of multiple mechanisms that may interact, and that diversity in skills, knowledge, and demographic characteristics, including personality traits, as well as the characteristics of the task at hand, affect team performance through multiple channels. And finally, in regards to transactive memory systems developed in the teams during the second experiment, it has been discovered that the total TMS has no correlation with collective intelligence, and this finding is contrary to my expectations, since the comprehensive literature review I conducted individually on transactive memory systems and collective intelligence points to the conclusion that both share common factors that are significantly correlated with their emergence in teams. In addition, in relation to the TMS component of credibility, the findings of my research show that the higher the communication and interaction between team members, the less accurate, reliable, and credible the knowledge shared within the team becomes. So this is a very interesting finding, I believe. We will proceed now to the main contributions of my research. The first contribution relates to the emphasis placed in considering collective intelligence as a systemic dimension that can provide organizations with a methodological assessment of their maturity levels in dealing with LOFIs. The second contribution relates to the attention drawn to the relation between collective intelligence and transactive memory systems. My research is the first to verify a positive correlation between transactive memory and high complexity tasks within the context of managing losses with the use of collective intelligence. And this is the third contribution of my research. In addition, my research has established a relationship between collective intelligence and the ability of spontaneously understanding the workings of the physical world. Furthermore, it is the first to report results in regards to personality traits in correlation with collective intelligence, especially within the context of managing losses. The development of the CIMA model is, of course, one of the main contributions of my research. The model provides valuable insight into a number of key issues related to the evolution and maturation of collective intelligence in teams and collective performance, and identifies some of the ideal characteristics a team must possess for the successful and sustainable management of losses. And of course, the distinction that provides between the primary and secondary factors influencing the maturation of collective intelligence in teams and collective performance is useful in both professional and academic contexts. Finally, my research also led to a managerial implication. It provides insightful information in taking an informed decision whether to assign a team or an individual to handle an activity within the management process of an adverse event, such as a crisis, depending on the characteristics of the situation encountered and based on the demographic information of the responders. At this point, I would like to thank you for attending this webinar. And of course, in case you have any questions related to my research, please feel free to contact me via email. I will be happy to answer them.
Tracy, before we go, I know that there are many exciting directions for future research. If you were to pick a topic for the next months, of course, I know that you have to write many papers out of this thesis. So supposedly that you do that by magic within one night. Can you share with us some insights with regards to future research?
Yes. One of the main directions for future research that has resulted with the conduction of my research is that the focus of my research has been to develop a maturity assessment model that employs collective intelligence. So it would be very interesting to see now how this model can actually be applied. So this is one of the main directions for future research that I am considering. A second direction that I think it worth pursuing is to examine further the relationship between transactive memory systems and collective intelligence.
Yes. And hopefully, if someone is interested out there, you will be qualified to be on board of his or her supervision team.
Yes, of course, I would be glad.
Lovely. So thank you, and thanks everyone who is attending, and we definitely are looking forward to presenting this interesting research to appropriate fora. Bye-bye for now.
Bye.